Happy New Year. I'm Cara Sofoko.
And I'm Gary Younge.
Each week, Gary and I will be talking about the stories in the news that are overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough.
This is Over the Top and Under the Radar.
Happy New Year, Gary.
Happy New Year. Yeah, when can we stop saying that?
Oh, I say it basically for all of January.
Do you?
Yeah, I've realised it's weird. I said it to one of my neighbours the other day and there was like a bit of a pause while she clearly was like, why are you still saying that? But I kind of can't help it. I just like the New Year spirit, you know?
See, I think you still got a little bit of time.
Also, if you've been doing the festive period right, this is the first week that you are surfacing from your pajamas on your sofa. If you haven't had to work, apologies to those who did. And, you know, thanks. But basically, we haven't been seeing people to say Happy New Year. We've been on our sofas, doom scrolling Instagram, completing Netflix. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but that was my holiday. And it was delightful, Gary. Finished all my fairy books.
All of the fairy books. Wouldn't they like sexy fairy books?
Well, she has a number of sagas. There were 5 and they're pretty dense, Gary, but yeah, I managed to plow through them all. Although, did you see that there's now been a controversy about my fairy books?
No, I would definitely have clocked that.
Oh, okay, so like, long story short,
Fairygate.
They draw on a lot of Celtic and Welsh kind of mythology, and there is an academic who believes it's problematic appropriation of Welsh culture. I'm willing to fight her in the streets so I can still read my fairy books. But there was a particularly hilarious Guardian headline. Fairy porn. Is this booming erotica genre an insult to Wales?
You know what? I actually did see that headline and I thought there's too much weird.
You did think of me?
I didn't, actually. I didn't. I think that's probably just as well. And
I think it's good. Yeah. I'm more than my fairy
You're more than
habits,
you're more than your fairy porn.
Wanted to just read a message from Amanda, who's from Patreon. She said, thank you for your excellent, illuminating, funny and politically spot on podcast. It was great to see the live show in Tottenham this month and to meet Gary. Big Gary fan, this less lucky than me. You can find us on all social media. We're on Blue Sky, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, we're on X. And our handle is @over_under_pod_, apart from on Blue Sky, where handles work a bit different. Big shout out. This is really exciting news to everyone who signed up to Patreon over the festive period. We have so many new festive sign-ups. Gary, do you want to read a few?
Whoa, yes. Maria, Anna, Clive, Rachel or Raquel, Rachel, Jake, Becky, Rebecca, Rob, Emily, Orla, Ben, Nia, Gav, Ben, Maza, Lizzie, and Yana.
Gary has stopped when the names get a little bit trickier. I'm going to say Joven or Joven or Joven, Amanda, John, Kate, Jeffrey, Jazzy Jam, great name, Jen, Nicola, Laura, Gay, George, Helen, Amanda, Giles, Kate, Phil, Penny, and Lisa. Thank you so much to everyone who signed up last year, the start of this year, to support us on Patreon with a regular gift. We now have 398 Patreon supporters.
So close to our 400 target. So thank you.
For Christmas.
Yeah, I'm taking it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm taking it too. Thank you to everyone who's helped. We're going to try and get to 500 Patreon supporters by the end of February.
Packages start at just £5 plus VAT a month. So if you want to keep the show running, access our weekly bonus episodes, weekly newsletter, exclusive over-under WhatsApp community, search Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon, and please put your money where your ears are.
So for new listeners, the show has a simple format. Gary and I have both been reading the news and found a story we think has been over-reported or reported in the wrong way, and a story that's been going under the radar and not being talked about enough. This week, I want to talk about Elon Musk and Emmanuel Macron.
I want to talk about grooming and why facts matter. Meta.
Okay, well, without further ado, shall I tell you why I think we've gone over the top on Elon Musk?
Yeah, please.
Some people will have successfully hibernated over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And to you, I say congratulations. For anyone who has been on social media or consuming traditional media, it has been hard to miss. Elon's been tweeting up a storm. It's been pretty chaotic, but I'd say the low points were the endorsement of the AFD and Free Tommy Robinson, another far-right figure who was recently held in contempt of court and is currently in prison for things he posted on social media that were interfering with a trial. I've been over Elon Musk for so long, even prior to his current right-wing incarnation. I just find him exhausting. And I don't think he's a genius. I just think he's a privileged man who's exploited a lot of people. But the thing I'm really over is the way that his unhinged and chaotic posting on X, a platform he owns, is just being parroted and repeated by a lot of mainstream media outlets. So to be clear, I think it is news when one of the richest men in the world donates to a political campaign or tries to put his finger on the scale of national politics in countries across Europe. But I don't think acting like these are like considered opinions of a political thinker rather than the sort of unhinged ramblings of someone who is spending a lot of time online and whose algorithm is clearly giving him a very curated view of the world. But I also just think like there is something new about Elon Musk, but there is also something which is not new, which is like rich people like to exert power and influence over politics. And Elon Musk is just a sort of slightly more modern version of Rupert Murdoch. And he does his quote unquote influencing out in the open. But again, sometimes people sort of act like he's brand new. This is brand new. These like in-depth analyses and podcast conversations about Elon Musk's political journey. Like, why does he think these things? And what could he mean when he endorses Farage? And then the next day he retweets him. And it's like, it's all a bit Mean Girls. It's all kind of teenage, like, oh, he doesn't like Farage. One day he called for Farage to be replaced as the leader of the Reform Party. And then the next day he retweeted him. And I'm not convinced we need this level of textual analysis from a guy who's firing off like just random nonsense to create and maintain chaos. I think, to use your parlance, Gary, he's just a bit of a git. He's got a lot of money. So that's why I'm over. But I'm interested in your opinion as a journalist. How would you report on him?
It is tricky. It is tricky that because an alternative view would be one of the richest men in the world is now saying this. Would you want to tell people? And my feeling is that it's the way that they do it. They treat his pronouncements like it's coming from the Elysee in Paris or Buckingham Palace or something. It's like, look, he's a rich git. And of course, we have to track what he does, but we don't have to be stenographers for everything he says, because what ends up happening is the media ends up being a conduit for his very extremist views.
I also think it's like we're how many years deep into this populist right-wing wave, and media outlets and politicians, which I would like to get onto, are still falling into the trap that they did with Donald Trump when he first emerged on the political stage, which is letting people who say outrageous things get even more free media by parroting the outrageous things endlessly. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the country, had his NHS announcements derailed because all the lobby wanted to ask about, all the journalists wanted to ask about was Elon Musk. And that also gets me onto the Labour response, which has just been like so disappointing. And it's such a feature, I think, of like what a clean shirt Keir Starmer is.
What a what shirt?
Clean shirt. Have you watched Peep Show?
No.
He's a clean shirt. So he doesn't get like, this is a street fight. And you're turning up with a binder full of facts being like, when I was heading the CPS, it's like this really kind of emotional and affronted reaction. And in the optics of what's happening, you're losing. This guy's a troll in the like true traditional internet meaning of a troll. Like he's not coming with facts. It's not just how much airtime the media gives Elon Musk. It's also how we still feel so ill prepared to deal with this wave of fascism and to understand what they're doing. And we're still turning up clean shirt, school uniform, school prefect being like, well, actually, that's wrong.
Well, there's also the problem that I would argue that the Labour Party is ill-equipped to take this on, given its own history and record of racism, that I do have a dog in a fight if it's between Jess Phillips and Elon Musk. But I'm not a big fan of Jess Phillips either. She has behaved in deeply problematic ways around non-white people. And so the Labour Party kind of made the nature of its appreciation for black people pretty clear. You can vote for us, but don't get out of line ever, ever.
I think my worry is whether it's in the United States, the United Kingdom, Hungary, France, Germany, these people are on the rise. We know that they are networked. We know that they are talking to one another and they're sharing playbooks. We need to up our game.
My over the top is grooming. There are a few things I want to say about grooming, and you kind of introduced an element. The grooming scandal relates to a series of cases, nearly all of them in the north of England, Telford, Rotherham and Oldham particularly, where mostly Pakistani men were involved in the sexual abuse, grooming as a gang of mostly white girls. Some of those cases went on for a long time. Some of them were a bit briefer. They've been coming up over the last sort of 15, 20 years. And it has been a source of mobilization for the far right and of a kind of intensification, drawing people ostensibly around pretending that it's a kind of feminist agenda now, defending women against these awful cultures that hate women and oppress women and so on. And it's been over the top because this is a completely racialized understanding of a problem. They're not talking about the 30 people who were abused in Camborne in Cornwall who were abused by white people. They're not talking about most people who sexually abuse people in Britain are white men. And this is primarily a gendered problem, not an ethnic problem. And that we get into this thing, and it's happened with mugging. Stealing people's handbags is a crime, but mugging was never a crime. But in the 80s, as Stuart Hall wrote about this brilliantly, mugging became the black mugger, and mugging became a route into a kind of racialized discourse that demonized entire black communities, and particularly black men. Similarly, with this issue, I don't think that the fact that they are Pakistani or of Pakistani heritage, given the way that this gang operates, I don't think it's irrelevant, but it's not the most relevant thing. And it is possible to speak up for, work to protect and demand the safety for these girls, regardless of their race, and to speak up for and work with the Pakistani community to protect them from racist attacks. These people who are raising this issue in this way, they don't care about the girls. And we know that because there have already been the demand. The thing that they're gathering around is that there should be an inquiry. Well, there've been a couple of inquiries, and the Tories refused to have any more inquiries when Kemi Badenoch, and sometimes she was in charge of children's welfare. She didn't call for any of this. Boris Johnson dismissed the inquiries as spaffing £60 million up a wall. Those were his words. And they didn't act on the recommendations from the inquiries. So we know that when they raise this, they're not concerned about, they are using it as a wedge issue to attack people in the Pakistani community.
I think there's a couple of threads I want to pick up on because, like, as someone with a bit of a background in violence against women and girls, this is, like so many tragedies, something that's been politicized by the far right for a very long time. So Nick Griffin, old school far right person, stood in Keighley in West Yorkshire in the 2005 general election off the back of what would become the sort of beginning of one of these scandals when things were first starting to emerge. So, like, this is racist textbook 101 to racialize men of color and say they're coming for white girls. And it can be possible that these grooming scandals are real and that they're being distorted. And I am incredibly angry about what happened and upset for those girls. But if you read any of the many reviews, it's not just that there were inquiries. There were two inquiries, two different jail reviews. The Telford review, I tried to look at it. There were 4 chapters. We're talking like potentially 1,000 pages worth of words. What has happened is people have cherry picked out the bits that relate to race, about people's Pakistani heritage, and they've ignored a lot of other pretty damning stuff about identity. One of the real common threads about these young women was that a lot of them were in the care system and a lot of them were vulnerable, which is something, if people do actually care about grooming, abuse of young people, the vast majority of it happens with an adult that is known to you, but it is very typical that if the person who's abusing you isn't a family member or a youth group leader, then it's because you are in a vulnerable position. And there are some appalling accounts of police officers believing that these young women were sort of complicit in their abuse because they were loose, because they were care leavers, because they were drinking. So like the idea that this is just about race, it's actually about so much more about who gets to be a victim and who gets to be innocent. So Professor Alexis Jay did a local review into Rotherham and a national inquiry into grooming. There was also an inquiry in Telford into the abuse scandal. And the real picture was about systemic failures in children's services and in the police force. And there were a number of people in some of these areas who felt uncomfortable to name the fact that the perpetrators were British Pakistani men, this phrase that I'd never heard until the grooming scandal, South Asian men. Like there were people who were uncomfortable naming that. But like, are we really saying that that is the core and the crux of like why young women are systematically abused and harassed? I do think it is an important story because violence against women and girls is like a national epidemic, but it is slightly infuriating when you're having a conversation with not even half the facts, right? With Elon Musk's take.
And this peculiar context where if black people do something, it's because they're black. Nobody is talking about the Catholic Church as though it is also an issue of race. Do you know what I mean? It's as though there is some kind of endemic deficiency among Catholics. It's understood as being a problem with the Catholic Church's hierarchy or just in well-being. Nobody suggests that that speaks to a fundamental problem with Protestantism or Christianity. It's understood in a very different way. So the manner in which this becomes racialized is really quite clear. And what I'm over is this incredibly bespoke, tailored, ethnicized kind of conversation.
What's been going under your radar this week?
It deeply relates to the previous two issues. Is facts that are going under the radar. And this was the week that Meta, Mark Zuckerberg, announced as the leader of Meta that he was getting rid of fact checkers in the US and moving whatever kind of support services that there were around that in terms of moderation from California to Texas, where he thought there would be less bias or no bias. He was quite explicit that the election was a turning point, he thought. Moderation was getting in the way, that it was a bit too much like censorship. You know, he made a free speech argument for there being less accurate things on his platform. The announcement was comprehensively reported, but I think what is less well appreciated is the nature of how these distorted facts shape our politics. So the first thing I want to say is Meta really needs more moderation and fact-checking, not less. UN investigators blamed the spread of hate speech on Facebook for some of the fueling the pogroms in Myanmar. In India, it was accused of failing to stop the spread of Islamophobic hate speech. Now, it's only in America at the moment that he's stopped these things, but clearly there's a problem there. The second is it's important to have a sense of how this ignorance plays out. So I'm going to give you an example. The average American believes that there are more than twice as many black people and immigrants as there are, 3 times as many Hispanics as there are, and 15 times as many Muslims as there are in the US. If you're walking around with that sense of delusion, of course, if I thought a kitten was 15 times bigger than it actually is, I'd be afraid of kittens. It's difficult to make an argument when we are all working on very different facts. People in Britain think there are 4 times as many Muslims as there are in Britain. So when people talk about legitimate concerns of the white working class or whoever, sometimes they're not legitimate. Sometimes they are entirely ill-informed. They are their concerns and they are welcome to them, but it would make more sense to be afraid of things that actually exist. And the level of misinformation and disinformation, it grows, it is growing, and it is exceptionally detrimental to our population. I think people get stuck on thinking that it's really about Trump and crowd sizes, people not understanding what Keir Starmer really means about this or that. But actually what it is people circulating the kind of statistics, they're not facts, that bolster their insecurity and therefore amplify and caffeinate the crisis that we're in. The final point that I would make about this is that it puts the onus both on mainstream news organizations to be more reliable and more on their fact checking than less. And the onus also comes on issues of regulation like the UK Online Safety Act and the EU Digital Services Act, which they're not perfect, but they are tools that can be used to check this wave of misinformation and disinformation that is going to come our way in even greater effect than it was. We saw over the summer where this can lead. I do think, and I'm not the first person to say this, but I can't remember who said it first. I think people may well die as a result of a ruling like this. I think what's going under the radar is the way in which these distorted facts are shaping our politics.
I'm going to add a little bit to the under the radar because I completely agree. Like Mark Zuckerberg arguably made this announcement because Trump's pick for the Federal Communications Commission, one of the bodies that regulates tech companies, a guy called Brendan Carr, wrote to Meta, Apple, Google, and Microsoft in November, telling them he didn't like their fact-checking programs, which is a sidebar conversation for another time. And then, presto, Mark Zuckerberg suddenly announces they're getting rid of fact-checking. So I think it's like gone under the radar, given how many of us consume information and like are on Meta platforms, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook. It's super sinister that this is part of the kind of corporate falling in line ahead of Trump becoming president again. B, I mean, I think you're not overstating at all to say this will lead to loss of life. Arguably, Meta's lack of moderation on its platform has already contributed to ethnic cleansing, as you mentioned, of the Rohingya in Myanmar. So like, it's scary and sinister and we need to be talking about it. But I don't know if I disagree with you, Gary, but I'm not sure that facts matter anymore. I feel like we're post-fact. No one gives a fuck. Facts exist and they're real, but like, to what extent do they actually matter now, Gary? I don't think people care about the truth. They just care about pointing out their own truth. So like, I care about this story and I care about the way that social media platforms monetize our attention and then like recycle, because it's not just there's false information on these platforms, it's that to the extent we can understand their algorithms, because they don't want us to understand them, they don't give academic researchers access, the algorithms thrive on misinformation and they crank it out because it's more engaging. Because to your point, an accurate fact about the number of Muslims in a country or black people in a country, like, it's just not that outrageous. But a lie, like London is under Sharia law, that's really engaging. And the algorithm is like, crank that shit out, serve that on everyone's page. I worry we're post-fact now and that it's too late and that the genie's out of the bowl.
There's this quote from George Orwell. He says, "We're all capable of believing things we know to be untrue. And then when we are finally proved wrong, impudently twisting the facts so as to show that we were right. Intellectually, it's possible to carry on this process for an indefinite time. The only check on it is that sooner or later, a false belief bumps up against solid reality, usually on a battlefield. And that's why it's the battlefield. There will be a large number of people who come to these arguments in poor faith. Then there'll be a large number of people who come to these arguments ill-informed. And the battlefield is where people realize that they've done all of the terrible things to asylum seekers and their life still isn't better. That they've done all these terrible things to Muslims and their daughters still aren't safer. We have to be there saying that's not true. I do believe that at a certain point when people are looking around for answers, the facts might be employed. Now, they could. And one of the interesting things about that quote is the thing of an indefinite time. What I don't think is that you hold up a fact and that people see it and then they go, okay, my bad. Actually, I am for racial equality and decolonization. Now I understand that. But that the lies that they are told have consequences and that we have to be there with a different narrative that's rooted in reality.
I think the starting point isn't facts, though. The starting point is values and a story. The thing that we're also missing and losing is trust, because you have to trust the person to believe that something's a fact. I would like facts to matter, and I do think there are objective facts and realities. The basis for them to be like heard and believed needs to be trust, which I think is increasingly being eroded. And starting with a compelling story that connects with people emotionally and speaks to certain values, like that is the beginning point. We have to put as much energy into understanding what is connecting with people and what is moving them as we do into like exactly knowing what is factually true. And please, no one think that I don't think climate scientists should be working out how much we're warming. But yeah, I think increasingly we have to understand that what connects with people and what moves them is more than the sort of objective reality. It's like facts plus something that's going to change this conversation and like move the needle. My under the radar it is about another Git. His name, I always butcher French names and pronunciations because I did not study French for very long at school. It's Emmanuel Macron is my under the radar for this week. So on Monday, Macron was giving a speech in which he was talking about, among other things, French troops that were stationed in West Africa until relatively recently. And he said, this is a translation, he said it in French, obviously, I think someone forgot to say thank you. It's okay. It will come with time. I say this for all the African heads of state who have not had the courage in the face of public opinion to hold that view. None of them would be a sovereign country today if the French army hadn't deployed in that region. Now, Gary, that's
bold.
It's a wild comment on itself, and it just hasn't been covered enough. And so I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about French colonialism and how deluded Emmanuel Macron is. So just for some context, France colonized swathes of Africa, like predominantly North, West and Central Africa. So Benin, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Madagascar. That is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the countries in Africa that France colonized. France also did this really nifty thing when it decolonized, where it didn't actually withdraw from African countries. So in 1945, maybe with Bretton Woods, they created something called the CFA franc. So when France left Africa and gave African countries their independence, they created what ended up being two currencies pegged to the franc and then the euro, which these African countries had to use and which were basically controlled by France. So without getting too deep into the economics of it, all the CFA countries, I think there were 14, had to deposit their foreign exchange reserves in the French treasury. So in Paris, had to be looked after by France. When the scheme first started in 1945, they had to deposit 100% of their foreign exchange reserves. And then between 1973 and 2005, it was 65%. And then until very recently, it was 50%. So former French colonies didn't have control of their monetary policy. They had to get France to loan them their money, and France borrowed their money at low or no interest rates. While these countries, if they wanted to borrow money to do things like infrastructure spending, Paris could be okay, but we'll charge you 14% interest. So French colonialism, really didn't end in the sense that we would understand it from the late 40s through to the 50s and 60s. Then you've got the rest of Francafrique, which is like the name for France's continued influence over the region. So like in a period of 4 decades, France is involved in about 30 coups in former French colonies. Basically, if they don't like the leader, they're happy to sort of get rid of them. And then you get to the fact that like France is incredibly dependent on nuclear power. I think of all countries, I think like French nuclear power plants, I think it's like 70% of French energy comes from nuclear sources. So for that, they need a lot of uranium. And shock horror, Niger and Chad are huge providers of uranium. So like Macron's being passive aggressive and asking people to thank him for stationing troops in the region to fight Islamic terrorists. Those of you who've not been following the region, there's been a wave of military coups, specifically in what people call Francophone West Africa, so like Niger, Burkina Faso. And generally, these military rulers have come in, got rid of leaders who were pretty close with Paris and French elites, and said that they're going to try and renationalize or take control of things like uranium mines, which are often owned by French multinationals. So like the passive aggressiveness is not classy, Macron, like just like someone forgot to say thank you, grow up. But B, like the idea that there's a single African nation that needs to thank France for anything is truly wild to me. And yeah, I think, especially given how much the British media love to talk shit about France, I'm genuinely shocked it's gone so under the radar.
This is quite so. As you know, I studied French at university, and this is pretty typical of. I remember having an argument with a French guy. This was in New York, and during the Iraq War, I'd been to see the Battle of Algiers. It was showing, and it was full. The cinema was full, and I just said, by way of conversation, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, in this moment, to see that played out while the Iraq War is taking place, and he was like, they're completely different. And I said, well, they are different, but I mean, there are parallels. He was like, no, because what happened in Algeria, and this was a guy like, I don't know, he was in banking or something. I knew his partner. He was basically like, France was looking after Algeria. And then when the Algerians said leave, the French said, okay then. And I was like, seriously, it was one of the most bitter wars in the whole decolonizing process. And he was like, nah, that was just extremists. There is this culture. They always believed that anyone ultimately could become French if they were if they were evolved enough, which, you know, like black people just aren't evolved enough to be French, but like one day they could be. And then this notion, because of Republican ideals, that race doesn't exist. And actually it's illegal to count people, to put it in the census. And the trouble for them, because of course race is a construct, trouble is racism isn't. And we see that in France quite a lot. I experienced it when I lived there. This week, we saw the death of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who some people are calling controversial and outspoken. Dude was a racist and a war criminal. But there's also French presidents had prior. So 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy goes to Dakar and talks about how the African has not fully entered into history. They've never launched themselves into the future, he says. You know, the people listening to this are just like, dude, piss off. 2/3 of the French troops during the Second World War were colonial. If it wasn't for Britain and America and those French troops, there wouldn't be a France now.
It's only recently, and I think it was Macron that apologized, like French massacred West African troops who had fought for them, Senegalese, I believe, in the Second World War, because they asked for their pay and they massacred them. And they've Macron only recently, apologized. No, and you're like, bro, there is an apology due, but it's not to you. And there's been a wave of coups in largely former French colonies in the last couple of years. Burkina Faso is a notable one, Niger. And like, as a consequence of those coups, and also in some democratic countries in the region, people have been asking French troops to leave. And it is incredibly popular to name the exploitative relationship that France has had with these countries and to say we're going to challenge it. So the new president of Ghana was inaugurated this week. The military leader of Burkina Faso attended the ceremony among other African leaders, and he was cheered. And like, if we don't understand the history of like France's involvement and Britain's involvement in Africa, then like this stuff doesn't make sense unless it's just, oh, well, Africans are backward. There was a coup. The military have taken over. Aside from the fact that France and the UK and the US have been like systematically backing coups when they were in their own interests. But like in some countries, which have been like systematically impoverished, have had not only their uranium like taken out of the country, but in some cases, French multinationals like own the uranium or the uranium mining sites. I think it's important we understand the history so we can understand what's happening now and why people are cheering a non-democratically elected leader, because he said, I'll deal with the French. Okay, well, it feels like a heavy start to 2025,
Yeah,
Gary.
well, 2025 is heavy.
I'm culturally appropriating my own culture. Gits are everywhere. Elon Musk is... Do you want to end on something positive?
I have a new beanie hat for my Christmas present. A family member, as in my daughter, she got me a hat that says Beanie Bob.
What does it say? Beanie Bob.
Beanie Bob.
For new listeners, Gary has pioneered the beanie hat as part of his transformation into an East London hipster. And he now has a collection. Does anything else? Oh, I got some good news. You won a prize. Gary won the award. What's it called?
I won the Robert B. Silvers Award for Journalism, which was unexpected and delightful. Comes out of America. Robert B. Silvers founded the New York Review of Books, and this is the Dudley Silvers Foundation. So it's a Dudley Silvers Award. That was a nice year. That and my Beanie Bob hat, which
Gary's got a beanie, and
I did receive the news while wearing my Beanie Bob hat.
Absolutely delightful. Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar. Remember to like, subscribe, leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you want to support the show, find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon.
You can sign up to get our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
And connect with us on socials at over_under_pod_.
And we're back, so we'll see you next week.